how do we get people from that Me Too thinking, that decision by Hippo, into exploring places to learn?
I think what's interesting about this is that when we look at anything we do in companies, we tend to think in terms of best practices. But the problem with best practices is that they're backward looking, they're retrospectives in nature, and they tell you what worked in contexts that usually don't exist anymore. Whereas when we look at breakthroughs in innovation, that's a departure, right, from a from best practice. Like Netflix was a huge departure from how we used to watch television. Tesla was a huge departure from how we've traditionally, built cars and fueled cars. So I think we need to reframe best practices really more as common practices, and then figure out like, okay, how do we then start experimenting in these different areas to find new ways of working, right? So, and I think what this is all about is like living in uncertainty. So I think if you think to yourself, okay, I have a very clear logical and psychological understanding of what my audience cares about. I think what we need to do is we need to look at what our competitors are doing, and then we need to really look at innovating in the areas where our competitors are not innovating, right? So I'll give you an example of this. I forget the name of the restaurant, but there was a restaurant in the UK, I think it was, where they wanted to kind of become a Michelin star restaurant, and the chef took his team to another restaurant. I think this is something that Rory Sutherland talks about. Went to another restaurant, and he said, "I don't want you to tell me like what this Michelin star restaurant does well. I want you to tell me what they don't do well." And they, at the end, when they debriefed, they said, "Well, the beer menu is not very good. It's kind of boring. Modelo, Heineken, that kind of stuff. And the coffee tastes like airline coffee." So then he said, "Okay, you're my beer sommelier. You're my coffee sommelier." They innovated in those areas. And I think there's so many examples of companies that do this. Figma is another great example of this. When everybody else was creating design software written for designers, Figma instilled cross-site network effects to make a design tool that's actually going to be useful for non-designers. And that's a cross-site network effect, right? You create something for one group that actually ends up being useful for another group. So founders and engineers were like, we love Figma because that actually makes our life easier as well. And nobody else was thinking along those terms. So to me, it's about like not just sitting in the history that we've already had, but then looking into those areas where your competition are not innovating. And then to your point earlier, Jim is saying, what is one thing we can do to validate whether this is something that our audience would like? And that could be a landing page. It could be something really, really small, and just see if there's a little blip of signal there. And then if there's a blip of signal there, add a little bit more meat to that bone, and then a little bit more meat. And then before you knew, you're starting to explore areas that might be very interesting. But to figure out what that's going to be, I think that's where you've got to, that's where you got to have that vision, and you got to surround yourself in other people's stories about, how they've innovated and done interesting things.